My mother lied about my father for 20 years, and I only found out the truth the day we buried her. I remember standing there in the quiet of the cemetery, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rows of headstones, the kind of stillness that usually brings comfort but felt strangely hollow that day. People were speaking in soft voices around me, offering condolences, shaking my hand, telling me how strong she had been, how proud she was of me. But their words drifted past like background noise I couldn't quite hold on to. I nodded when I was supposed to nod, said thank you when it was expected, but inside, there was nothing. No tears, no overwhelming grief. Just a dull, distant emptiness that made me feel like I was watching someone else's life unfold from a few feet away. My name is Daniel Collins. I'm 42 years old, and until that moment, I believed I understood my family. I believed I knew who my father was, and more importantly, who he wasn't. My mother had spent 2 decades telling me the same story, carefully, consistently, without ever breaking character. She said my father, Robert Collins, walked out on us when I was a kid. She said he chose a different life, that he didn't want the responsibility, that he left without looking back. And I believed her. Of course I did. I was 8 years old when he disappeared, too young to question the narrative, too dependent on her to imagine she might not be telling the truth. Every birthday he missed, every school event where there was an empty seat, every holiday where it was just the two of us, I told myself the same thing she had told me. He didn't care enough to stay. Over time, that belief settled into something solid, something permanent. It shaped how I saw him, and in a way, how I saw myself. I learned not to expect people to stay. I learned that sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who leave the easiest. And my mother, she was the one who stayed. She worked long hours, kept the house running, made sure I never went without the things I needed. She wasn't warm in the way other mothers were, not affectionate or overly expressive, but she was steady, reliable. She built her entire identity around being the one who didn't leave. So I trusted her version of the past without hesitation. Standing there at her funeral, watching as they lowered her casket into the ground, I realized something that unsettled me more than the silence inside my chest. I didn't actually know if any of it was true. The thought came quietly, almost like a whisper I couldn't ignore. It didn't come from anything obvious, no dramatic revelation or sudden confession. It came from something small, a detail that didn't fit. Earlier that day, just before the service began, I had been sitting alone in the front pew of the chapel, staring at the program with her name printed neatly across the top, when an older man approached me. He looked to be in his 70s, dressed in a dark suit that had seen better days, his posture careful but deliberate. He asked if I was Daniel. I told him I was. He nodded slowly, studying my face in a way that made me uncomfortable, like he was searching for something familiar. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said, "You have your father's eyes." I remember blinking, caught off guard, because that wasn't something anyone had ever said to me before. My mother used to tell me I looked nothing like him. She said I took after her side of the family completely. I asked the man how he knew my father, and he hesitated just long enough to make the air between us feel heavier. "I knew Robert very well," he said. "Closer than most." There was something in his tone, something careful, almost restrained, like he was choosing his words with precision. I should have let it go. It was a funeral. People say things they don't fully mean. But I didn't. I asked him what my father was like. And that's when everything started to shift. The man didn't answer right away. He looked toward the front of the chapel, where my mother's casket rested, then back at me. "Not the man you think he was," he said quietly. And in that moment, standing between the version of my past I had always believed and the possibility that it wasn't real, I felt something crack open inside me. Not pain. Not yet. Just the beginning of something I couldn't name, something that would follow me out of that chapel, into the cold air of the cemetery, and straight into a truth I wasn't prepared to face. I stayed until the last handful of people drifted away, until the polite murmurs faded and the cemetery returned to that quiet, indifferent stillness that seemed to swallow everything whole. The workers stood at a distance, waiting, giving me space I did not ask for, but did not reject either. I kept my hands in the pockets of my coat, fingers curled around nothing, staring at the polished wood as it disappeared beneath the ground. I thought I would feel something then, some kind of finality, some weight pressing down on my chest, but it never came. Instead, My mind kept circling back to the man in the chapel, to the way he had said those words with such quiet certainty, not the man you think he was. It replayed in my head in a loop, each time sounding less like an opinion and more like a warning I had ignored for far too long. I did not notice him walking up beside me until he spoke again, his voice lower now, almost cautious. He said my name once, just Daniel, as if testing whether I would turn. I did. Up close, I could see the lines in his face more clearly, the kind that come from years of holding things in rather than letting them out. He introduced himself as Thomas Harris. The name did not mean anything to me, and I told him that. He nodded, like he expected that response. He said he had not been in contact with my family for a long time, not since before my father left. That word again, left. It sounded different now, less solid than it had my entire life. I asked him what he meant earlier, about my father not being who I thought he was. He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked out across the cemetery, his gaze settling somewhere far beyond the rows of headstones, like he was searching for the right way to say something that had been sitting unspoken for years. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something that suggested this conversation was long overdue. He said my father had talked about me all the time, that he used to carry a photograph of me in his wallet, worn at the edges from being handled so often. I felt a flicker of something then, not quite emotion, but close enough to make me uncomfortable. I told him that did not make sense, that a man who walked away from his family does not carry pictures of the child he abandoned. Thomas did not argue. He simply said, sometimes people do not leave because they want to. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unresolved. I felt a tension build in my chest, the kind that comes from standing too close to something you are not ready to see clearly. I asked him to explain, more sharply than I intended, and he glanced at me again, measuring, deciding. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a small envelope. It was plain, slightly creased, the kind of thing that could have been sitting in a drawer for years. He held it out to me, but did not let go right away. He said he had promised himself he would only give it to me if the time was right. I almost laughed at that, because there is never a right time for something like this. Still, I took it. It felt lighter than I expected, almost insignificant, like it could not possibly carry the weight he was implying. My name was written on the front in careful, deliberate handwriting. Not printed. Written. I stared at it for a moment longer than I should have, trying to place something about it, something familiar I could not quite reach. I asked him where it came from. He said my father had asked him to hold on to it, just in case. Just in case what? I asked. Thomas looked at me then, directly, no hesitation this time. Just in case you were ever ready to know the truth. I did not open it right away. I stood there, holding it in my hand, feeling the edges press into my palm, as if grounding me to that moment whether I wanted it or not. For 20 years, I had lived with a version of my past that felt complete, stable, unquestionable. And now, with a single envelope, that entire foundation felt like it was starting to shift beneath my feet. I realized then that whatever was inside it, whatever explanation, or confession or correction it contained, it was going to change something I could not undo. And for the first time that day, I felt something close to fear. I did not open the envelope at the cemetery. I told myself it was because I needed time, because something like that deserved more than a few rushed seconds standing in the cold, but the truth was simpler than that. I was not ready. I drove home in silence, the envelope resting on the passenger seat beside me, its presence impossible to ignore. Every red light felt longer than usual, every mile stretched out in a way that made me aware of every passing second. I kept glancing at it without meaning to, like it might change if I looked at it long enough, like the handwriting would rearrange itself into something less personal, less deliberate. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had. Neat, quiet, predictable. The porch light was still on, set to a timer my mother had installed years ago and never bothered to change. For a moment, I just sat there with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the faint ticking sound as the car cooled down. This was the house where every version of the story had been told. The kitchen where she explained why he left. The living room where she reassured me it was not my fault. The hallway where she reminded me, again and again, that some people just do not stay. I had accepted those words without question. I had built my understanding of love, loyalty, and family around them. And now, sitting there with that envelope within reach, I realized how easily all of that could come apart. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my hands. The paper was worn but intact, sealed carefully, as if whoever closed it had taken their time, making sure it would not open by accident. My name stared back at me again, written in a style that felt unfamiliar and yet oddly precise, like someone who chose each letter with intention. I took it inside and placed it on the kitchen table, the same table where my mother and I had shared countless quiet meals over the years. The room felt different now, not because anything had changed physically, but because something in me had shifted. The walls seemed to hold more than just memories. They held questions. I stood there for a long time, just looking at the envelope, as if it might speak first and save me the trouble of opening it. But it did not. It just sat there, silent, patient. Finally, I pulled out a chair and sat down. The wood creaked slightly under my weight, a familiar sound that grounded me for a moment. I slid my finger under the flap and broke the seal in one careful motion. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. No extra documents. No photographs. Just one page. I unfolded it slowly, my hand steady in a way that surprised me. For a second, I hesitated, my eyes hovering just above the first line, aware that once I started reading, there would be no going back. Then I lowered my gaze. The handwriting matched the name on the envelope. Clean. Controlled. Intentional. The first sentence was simple. It did not try to explain everything at once. It did not soften what it was about to reveal. It just stated something that made my breath catch in a way I had not felt all day. It said that if I was reading this, it meant enough time had passed for the truth to matter more than the story I had been told. I felt a tightening in my chest then, sharper than anything I had experienced at the funeral, as if the weight of 20 years had suddenly shifted direction. I kept reading, each word pulling me further away from the version of my past I had always accepted. The letter did not sound like a man who had walked away. It sounded like someone who had been pushed to the edge of something he could not control. He wrote about choices that were not really choices, about leaving not as an act of abandonment, but as something that had been decided for him. I stopped halfway through, my eyes fixed on a single line that refused to settle in my mind. He said he never wanted to leave me. Not once. Not for a second. The words did not feel dramatic. They felt measured, almost restrained, as if he had spent years deciding how to say them in the fewest possible sentences. I leaned back, in my chair, the paper still in my hand, and stared at the empty space across the table where my mother used to sit. For the first time, I realized that the story she had told me might not just be incomplete. It might be entirely wrong. And if that was true, then everything I thought I understood about my father, about her, about myself, was no longer as certain as I had believed. I went back to the letter, slower this time, forcing myself to read each word without skipping ahead, without trying to soften what was written there. The lines did not accuse. They did not beg for sympathy. They simply explained, piece by piece, a version of events that felt unfamiliar and yet strangely grounded in a kind of quiet truth I could not easily dismiss. He wrote about the last year before he left, about how things had changed in ways I was too young to notice. He said the house had become quieter, not in a peaceful way, but in the kind of silence that comes when conversations stop before they begin. He described arguments that were never loud enough to draw attention, but constant enough to wear everything down. He never used harsh words about my mother. Not once. Instead, he chose careful phrases, describing tension, distance, decisions that were made without him being fully part of them. I found that detail unsettling in a way I could not fully explain. If he had been the kind of man I believed him to be, it would have been easier if the letter had been filled with anger or blame. But it was not. It was controlled, measured, almost protective. He said there came a point when he was told it would be better for everyone if he stepped away. Not temporarily, not to fix things, but permanently. I felt my hand tighten slightly around the paper at that line, the words settling heavily in my mind. Told. Not decided. Not chosen. Told. I leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, reading the sentence again to make sure I had not misunderstood it. The meaning did not change. He explained that he had tried to argue at first, that he had suggested counseling, time, anything that might keep the family intact, but those options were dismissed. He did not describe the moment as dramatic. There was no single event, no clear breaking point. Just a gradual shift that ended with a decision being placed in front of him like it had already been made. He said he was given a choice that did not feel like a choice at all. Leave quietly and allow things to remain stable for me, or stay and risk creating a situation that would affect me more deeply than he was willing to accept. I paused again, my eyes lingering on that part longer than anything else. The idea that he left to protect me did not fit with anything I had been told growing up. It did not align with the image I had carried for 20 years. And yet, the way he wrote it, without exaggeration, without trying to convince, made it harder to dismiss outright. I pushed my chair back slightly, the legs scraping softly against the floor, and stood up, pacing once across the kitchen before turning back toward the table. The house felt different now, like every memory inside it had shifted slightly out of place. I thought about all the times my mother had repeated the same explanation, the same simple version of events. He left. He did not want to stay. It was better this way. At the time, those words had felt complete. Now they felt selective. I sat down again and continued reading. He wrote about the years after he left, about how he had tried to stay connected in ways that would not disrupt my life. He mentioned letters he never sent, phone calls he almost made, moments where he chose distance because he believed it was what I had been told was best. There was a line near the end that stood out more than anything else. He said he had always hoped that one day, when I was old enough to decide for myself, I would be given the chance to see the full picture. Not his version, not hers, but the truth in between. I stared at that sentence, feeling something shift again, deeper this time. Because if what he was saying was real, then that chance had never been given to me. It had been withheld. Carefully. Consistently. For 2 decades. I lowered the paper slowly, my gaze drifting toward the window where the last light of the day was fading into a dim, colorless sky. The realization did not come all at once. It built gradually, like something settling into place after being loose for too long. If my father had not simply walked away, then my entire understanding of why my family broke apart was incomplete. And if it was incomplete, then it meant someone had chosen which parts one was allowed to know. I looked back at the empty chair across from me, the one my mother used every single day, and for the first time, I did not see certainty when I thought of her. I saw questions, and the most unsettling part was not that I did not have the answers. It was that I was starting to understand she might have known them all along. I did not sleep that night. The letter stayed on the kitchen table where I had left it, unfolded, exposed, as if covering it again would somehow make it less real. I moved through the house in slow, restless loops, stopping in places that had once felt ordinary and now carried a different weight. The hallway where I used to wait for my mother to come home from work. The living room where she would sit in the same chair every evening, watching television without really paying attention. The kitchen where she repeated the same story about my father so many times that it became something I never questioned. I tried to line up the version of her I had known with the possibility that she had hidden something this significant from me, and the two images refused to settle together. Around 2 a.m, I found myself standing in front of the hallway closet. It was not a place I thought about often, just a narrow space filled with coats, old boxes, things that had not been touched in years. I do not know what made me open it. Maybe it was the way the letter kept echoing in my head, or maybe it was something simpler, a quiet instinct telling me there was more in this house than I had ever looked for. I reached up and pulled down one of the boxes from the top shelf. Dust settled lightly in the air as I placed it on the floor and opened it. Inside were photographs, documents, small objects that had been kept but never displayed. I sat down and started going through them one by one. Most of the pictures were exactly what I expected. School photos, birthdays, moments that had been carefully preserved. But as I moved deeper into the box, I began to notice something else. Gaps. Missing pieces. There were no photographs of my father after a certain point. Not even a single one. It was as if he had been removed from the visual history of our lives entirely. That absence had never felt strange to me before. It had simply matched the story I had been given. Now, it felt deliberate. I set the photos aside and kept searching. At the bottom of the box, underneath a stack of old papers, I found a smaller envelope. It was thinner, more worn than the one Thomas had given me. My name was not on it. Instead, there was no label at all. Just a simple seal that had never been broken. I hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside were several folded letters, each one dated from years ago. The handwriting was the same as the one in the letter I had just read. My father's. I unfolded the first one carefully. It was addressed to me. The date at the top placed it just a few months after he left. The words were simple, almost cautious, like he did not know if they would ever be read. He wrote about missing me, about hoping I was doing well in school, about small details that suggested he had been thinking about my life even after he was no longer part of it. There was nothing inappropriate, nothing that would have confused or upset a child. Just a father trying to stay connected in the only way he could. I moved to the next letter, then the next. The pattern repeated. He wrote consistently, carefully, never crossing a line, never saying anything that would disrupt the version of reality I had been living in. And yet, none of these letters had ever reached me. I sat there on the floor, surrounded by pieces of a history I had never been allowed to see, and felt something inside me shift in a way that was no longer subtle. This was not just a matter of perspective or interpretation. These were real, physical things. Letters written, words chosen, efforts made, and they had been kept hidden, not lost, not forgotten, hidden. I leaned back against the wall, one of the letters still open in my hands, and stared at the ceiling. The silence of the house pressed in around me, heavier now, filled with everything that had not been said. For 20 years, I had believed that my father chose not to be part of my life, that he walked away without trying to come back. But sitting there with those letters, I realized something that settled deep and solid in my chest. He had not stopped reaching out. Someone had stopped me from seeing it. And the person who controlled every piece of my world back then, every story, every explanation, every truth I accepted without question, was the same person whose voice I could still hear in my head, steady and certain, telling me he did not care enough to stay. The next morning, the house felt unfamiliar in a way that had nothing to do with the layout or the furniture. It was the same space I had lived in for years, the same walls, the same quiet hum of appliances in the background, but something underneath it had shifted. I made coffee out of habit, going through the motions without thinking, measuring, pouring, waiting for the machine to finish, but even that simple routine felt disconnected, like it belonged to a version of me that no longer fit. The letters were still spread across the table where I had left them, each one a piece of something I had never been meant to see. I picked one up again, not because I expected to find something new, but because I needed to confirm that what I had read the night before had not changed in the light of day. It had not. The words were the same. Careful. Consistent. Present. My father had not disappeared from my life in the way I had been told. He had been kept at a distance, deliberately, repeatedly, by someone who controlled what I was allowed to know. I set the letter down and looked around the kitchen, letting my eyes move slowly across the space. The cabinets. The clock on the wall. The chair my mother always used. Everything about this room had once felt stable, grounded in something I never questioned. Now it felt curated, selected, as if every memory I had formed here had been guided, in a direction I never noticed. I walked down the hallway toward her bedroom, my steps quieter than usual, as if I was entering a space I was not entirely sure I had permission to be in anymore. The door was slightly open. I pushed it gently and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she had left it. The bed neatly made. The dresser organized. Nothing out of place. My mother had always been precise like that. Everything arranged, everything controlled. I moved toward the dresser and opened the top drawer. Inside were the usual things, jewelry, small keepsakes, items that held personal meaning but no answers. I closed it and moved to the next. More of the same. Nothing that explained what I had found. Nothing that connected the story I had been told to the reality that was now unfolding in front of me. I almost stopped there, almost convinced myself that I had already found enough. But something in me pushed further. I crossed the room to the small desk in the corner, the one she used for bills and paperwork. The surface was clean, just a lamp and a stack of unopened mail. I sat down and opened the top drawer. Inside were neatly organized folders, each labeled in her careful handwriting. Finances, insurance, medical, everything in its place. I flipped through them slowly, not expecting anything, just following the same quiet instinct that had led me to the closet the night before. Then I saw it. A folder without a label, tucked slightly behind the others, as if it had been placed there quickly and never moved again. I pulled it out and set it on the desk. For a moment, I just looked at it, The same hesitation from the night before settling in again. Then I opened it. Inside were documents. Not many, but enough to make my chest tighten as I started to go through them. Legal papers. Dates. Signatures. I recognized my father's name immediately. Robert Collins. And beneath it, my mother's. Margaret Collins. I read the first page, then the second, the language formal, precise, but clear enough that I did not need to interpret what it meant. It was an agreement. One that outlined terms I had never been aware of. Living arrangements. Custody. Communication restrictions. My eyes slowed over that part, reading it again to make sure. I understood it correctly. Communication restrictions. It was not just that he had been kept away. It had been formalized, structured, defined. There were conditions about contact, about what could be said, about what could not be shared. I felt my grip tighten slightly on the edge of the paper, not out of anger, but out of something deeper, something more controlled. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not a difference in perspective. It was a system, carefully constructed, carefully maintained. I sat back in the chair, the documents resting in my lap, and stared ahead without focusing on anything in particular. For 20 years, I had lived inside a version of my life that felt complete. Every explanation had fit. Every absence had an answer. But now, piece by piece, that structure was being replaced by something else. Something more complex. More deliberate. I thought about the letters again. The ones I had never received. The ones that had been written but never delivered. And then I looked down at the documents in my hands, at the signatures, at the dates, at the clear, undeniable proof that what I had been told was not just incomplete. It had been controlled. I stood up slowly, holding the folder carefully, and looked around the room one more time. Everything was still in its place. Nothing had changed. And yet, nothing felt the same. Because for the first time, I was not just questioning what had happened. I was beginning to understand how it had been made to look like something else entirely. I did not call anyone that day. Not Thomas. Not a lawyer. Not a friend. There was a part of me that understood this was not something that could be processed through conversation yet. It required silence first. Space. Time to let the pieces settle into something that resembled understanding instead of reaction. I took the folder back to the kitchen and laid everything out across the table. The letters on one side, the legal documents on the other, like two versions of the same story that had never been allowed to meet. For a while, I just stood there, looking at them, letting the contrast speak for itself. On one side, a father who had tried to reach out, carefully, consistently. On the other, a system that had prevented that connection from ever forming. And somewhere in the middle of those two realities was my mother, the one person who had controlled how both sides were presented to me. I sat down slowly, pulling one of the documents closer. This time, I read it differently. Not just the words, but the structure, the intent, the way it was written to define limits rather than explain reasons. There was no mention of harm, no indication that contact would have been dangerous or inappropriate. Only language that framed distance as necessary, as beneficial, as something decided in the interest of stability. Stability. That word stood out now. It had been used often in my childhood, usually by my mother, usually when explaining why certain things were the way they were. At the time, it sounded responsible, protective. Now it felt strategic. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting my thoughts move without trying to organize them. Memories began to surface, small ones at first. Moments I had never questioned. Times when I asked about my father and received the same calm, controlled answer. Times when I noticed other kids with two parents and accepted, without resistance, that my situation was simply different. But as those memories replayed, something else started to appear beneath them. Details I had overlooked. The way she would redirect conversations when I asked too many questions. The way certain topics would end quickly, without room for follow-up. The consistency of her tone, never emotional, never uncertain, always steady. It had felt like strength. Now it felt like control. I opened my eyes and looked at the empty chair across from me again, imagining her sitting there the way she had every morning, coffee in hand, posture straight, expression composed. I tried to picture her knowing everything I had just discovered, knowing about the letters, the attempts, the restrictions, and still choosing to maintain the same version of events year after year. The thought did not bring anger the way I expected it to. It brought something quieter, something heavier, a kind of realization that did not explode, but settled in slowly, making itself impossible to ignore. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where everything continued as usual. Cars passing, neighbors going about their day. Nothing outside had changed. But inside, the foundation of what I believed about my own life was no longer stable. I thought about what Thomas had said. Not the man you think he was. At the time, I assumed he was talking about my father. Now, I was not so sure. I turned back toward the table, toward the evidence laid out in front of me, and understood something that had been building since the moment I opened that first letter. This was not just about discovering a hidden truth. It was about recognizing that the person I trusted most had shaped my reality in ways I never questioned. And once you see that clearly, once you understand that your past was not just lived but managed, you cannot go back to seeing it the same way again. I picked up the final letter again, the one I had not finished the night before, and sat down with a kind of stillness that felt different from everything that came before. It was no longer hesitation. It was acceptance that whatever remained in those pages would not change the fact that everything already had. I read the next line slowly, my eyes moving with a kind of focus that came from knowing there was no version of this that would leave me unchanged. He wrote about her, not in anger, not in blame, but in a way that felt careful, almost deliberate, as if he was protecting something even now. He said she believed she was doing what was right. That phrase stayed with me longer than anything else on the page. Believed she was doing what was right. Not that she was right. Not that he agreed. Just that she believed it. I kept reading. He explained that before he left, there had been conversations I was never meant to hear. Decisions made about what kind of life I should have, what influences I should be exposed to, what version of stability would serve me best in the long run. He said she was certain that a clean break would be easier for me than a complicated truth. That growing up with a clear story, even if it was incomplete, would protect me from confusion, from divided loyalties, from questions a child should not have to carry. I felt my grip on the paper tighten slightly, not out of anger, but out of something harder to define. Because for the first time, I could see the shape of her reasoning, even if I did not agree with it. He wrote that he argued against it, that he believed distance would create more damage than honesty ever could, but in the end, the decision had already been set in motion. The legal documents I had found were not just formalities. They were the structure that allowed that decision to become permanent. He said he chose to step away because the alternative would have forced me into a conflict I was too young to understand, one that might have changed how I saw both of them in ways that could not be undone. I stopped there, my eyes fixed on the words, trying to reconcile what I was reading with everything I had felt growing up. Because the absence I remembered was not clean. It was not simple. It was filled with questions I had learned not to ask, with a kind of quiet confusion that never fully disappeared. I continued reading. Near the end of the letter, his tone shifted slightly, not in emotion, but in clarity. He said that if I was reading this now, it meant the time for protection had passed. That whatever reason had justified the silence before no longer applied. And then he wrote something that settled deeper than anything else he had said. He wrote that the truth was never meant to protect him or her. It was meant to protect me. But protection, when it lasts too long, begins to look a lot like control. I lowered the letter slowly, the weight of that sentence pressing into something I had not fully allowed myself to consider until that moment. For 20 years, I had believed my life was shaped by absence, by abandonment, by a simple story that explained everything I needed to know. But sitting there now, with the letter in my hands and the documents spread across the table, I could see something else entirely. A version of my life that had been carefully constructed, not out of cruelty, not even out of selfishness, but out of a belief that controlling the truth was the same as protecting it. I looked toward the hallway, toward the room where my mother had lived every day of those 20 years, and for the first time, I did not see her as someone who had simply told me a lie. I saw someone who had made a decision, one that shaped every part of my understanding of family, trust, and love. And the hardest part was not realizing that she had hidden the truth. It was realizing that she might have believed, all along, that she was doing it for me. I sat there for a long time after I finished reading, not moving, not thinking in the way I usually did, just letting everything settle into place without trying to rearrange it into something easier to accept. The letters, the documents, the quiet explanations that came too late to ask questions about, they all existed now in the same space, no longer separate pieces, but part of a single truth I could not ignore. I looked down at my hands, still resting on the table, and realized they felt steady. Not calm, not at peace, just steady, like something inside me had stopped resisting what was already clear. For most of my life, I believed my father had chosen to leave me. That belief shaped how I saw him, how I spoke about him, how I carried his absence through every stage of my life. It shaped how I understood loyalty, how I measured trust, how I decided who deserved to stay and who did not. And now, with everything laid out in front of me, I understood that belief had never really been mine. It had been given to me, repeated to me, reinforced until it felt like something I had come to on my own. I stood up slowly and began gathering the letters, stacking them carefully, not out of habit, but out of something closer to respect. Each one represented an attempt that had never reached me, a version of connection that had been denied before I even knew it existed. I placed them back into the envelope I had found, sealing them again even though there was no longer any reason to keep them hidden. Then I turned to the folder with the documents, closing it with the same deliberate care, as if handling them too quickly might make everything feel less real. I carried both to the living room and set them on the coffee table, the same table where my mother used to sit in the evenings, her posture straight, her expression composed, her version of the world always clear and certain. I sat down in her chair, something I had never done before, and let myself look at the room from her perspective. It was a strange feeling, seeing the same space from a different angle, noticing details I had overlooked, understanding how easily a single point of view can shape everything around it. I tried to imagine what it must have been like for her, holding on to that decision for so many years, repeating the same story, maintaining the same certainty, never allowing anything to slip. Whether she questioned it or not, whether she ever considered telling me the truth and chose not to, whether she believed, even at the end, that she had done the right thing. Those answers were gone now. There was no conversation left to have, no explanation to ask for, just the reality of what had been done and the understanding that it could not be undone. I leaned back in the chair and let my gaze settle on the envelope in front of me. For a moment, I thought about what I would have said if I had known all of this sooner. If I had been given the chance to ask questions, to challenge the story, to see both sides before forming my own conclusions. But that moment never existed. It had been replaced with something else, something quieter and far more controlled. I exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of acceptance, because the truth had not destroyed me the way I once believed it would. It had done something else entirely. It had taken everything I thought I understood and shown me how incomplete it had been. It had forced me to see my father not as someone who walked away, but as someone who had been kept away. And it had forced me to see my mother not as someone who simply raised me alone, but as someone who decided which parts of my life I was allowed to know. I did not feel anger in that moment. Not the kind that burns or demands action. What I felt was something colder, more final. A kind of clarity that does not ask for resolution because it already understands there will not be one. I looked around the room one last time, taking in the familiar details that no longer felt the same, and realized that nothing in my life had actually changed. The house was still here. The memories were still here. The years had already passed. But the meaning behind all of it had shifted in a way that could not be reversed. And as I sat there in the quiet, with the truth laid out in front of me and no one left to explain it, I understood something that settled deeper than anything else I had learned. I had spent 20 years believing I had been abandoned. But the truth was, I had been protected from something I never chose to be protected from. And that difference, more than anything else, was what I would have to live with now.